Welcome to this nonprofit and voluntary sector quarterly podcast. I'm Danielle Bath, editorial assistant at Sage Publications. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Kellie Liket at Erasmus University Rotterdam. She recently published a research article in Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly entitled Nonprofit Organizational Effectiveness, Analysis of Best Practices. Hello, Kellie, and thank you for joining me today. To start us off, can you briefly introduce your research to us?
We are looking at nonprofit organizations. They are currently under great pressure to demonstrate that they are effective. These are both external pressures from donors who want to know that their donations are used to a good cause, as well as internal pressures, as people in the organization want to find out what is and what isn't working, and whether progress is being made on the organizational mission. For example, if you look at nonprofits in the educational sector, they might wonder whether they're actually succeeding in improving the children's test scores through their educational programs. Or nonprofits in the health sector want to know, for example, whether women are indeed choosing to breastfeed as a result of their campaigns. In America, there are a few rating agencies, such as the watchdogs GuideStar and Charity Navigator, and they have picked up on this need for organizations to demonstrate their effectiveness. However, their models really rely heavily on financial ratios, and they don't actually look at indicators of effectiveness. But because there was so much research out there about the best practices that do contribute to the effectiveness of organizations, we set out this study so we could test the extent to which these practices are also identified in the literature, if they aligned with the views of practitioners about best practices that contribute to the effectiveness.
Can you describe your methodology for us?
Well, our research process actually existed of 4 steps. We started out with the literature review, where we identified the management practices that, according to previous research, contribute to the effectiveness of nonprofits. This resulted in a really long list of 52 management practices that had been hypothesized or empirically proven in the literature to have an impact on the effectiveness of a nonprofit. In the second step, we created a focus group, and that existed of 20 actors from the Dutch nonprofit sector. This included, for example, consultants, managers, CEOs, in-house evaluators, and academic researchers. We asked this group to draw up as many management practices as they could think of that they believed to contribute to effectiveness in nonprofits. It's important to say here that the group was not aware of the results of the literature review, and they just started blank. The focus group drew up a list of 36 practices that they believed would enhance the effectiveness of nonprofits. It was very interesting to see that with the exception of 2 practices, all of the ones that the group identified were also part of the list of the effectiveness best practices that we got from the literature, although sometimes they were, of course, formulated slightly differently. When we merged the 2 lists, we were left with 34 practices, and as a third step, we designed a survey to measure the extent to which these nonprofits actually have these practices in place. In some of the cases, we felt that certain conditions were way too subjective to identify reliably, and we therefore didn't include them in the final survey. These are things such as charismatic leadership, willingness to change, ambition, or employee motivation. To check whether the questionnaire items would be understood correctly by nonprofits when they would fill out the survey and whether they would actually answer them reliably, an additional questionnaire item was added, and this one functions as a control question. In most cases, this required nonprofits to give an example or, for example, to answer a same question twice, which we formulated in a different way. In the fourth and last step, we tested the questionnaire with an expert group, and we ended up with a questionnaire that existed of 29 items, with which we conducted a pilot study with 454 Dutch nonprofits in the health sector. From this group, 83 organizations fully completed the questionnaire, so we had a response rate of 15%. On the basis of the results of this pilot study, we created the final questionnaire that consisted of the 26 best practices.
So what are these 26 best practices that you found?
Well, it's easiest to cluster these best practices into 9 themes. And then again, we actually grouped them into 3 pillars. So there are 3 pillars and 9 themes in total. The pillars are transparency, organization, and programs. First, within the transparency pillar, there's the theme of reporting. And this is about things such as having a strategic plan and an annual report. Then there's the theme of accessibility. As for an organization to be transparent, next to reporting your information, you must also be accessible for questions and complaints. The last one within the transparency pillar is online publication, which include putting a strategic plan and annual report and the identity of all your board members online. This practice of putting everything online was strongly endorsed by the panel of the nonprofits and the experts in the focus group. And this might be caused actually by the concerns relating to the abuse of legal benefits and responsibilities of certain nonprofits in the Netherlands. In the organizational characteristics pillar, the first theme was focus, which contains best practices that address whether an organization actually operates with the aim of advancing its mission in a very clear and focused manner. This included, for example, having a clear mission statement, for there to be a clear link between the mission statement and the main activities of the nonprofit, and for the goals in the strategic plan to be defined in a SMART way, where SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. The second theme within this organizational characteristics pillar was strategy, which included best practices such as the presence of a context analysis, for organizations to remain thinking about alternative activities that could help them in fulfilling their goals, and to carry out a risk analysis about the organization's environment. The third theme within the organizational characteristic pillars concerns the board, which is the body that has the legal responsibility for making sure that the nonprofit organization's mission is fulfilled. The best practices here were that there should be a clear separation between the duties and the responsibilities of the board and the executive body, and for there to be independence of the board members. The last pillar is the programs. And here we have three themes: design, ownership, and evaluation. First, best practice suggested that when you make decisions about programs, it's important to base them on empirical evidence that includes input from all the relative stakeholders. Second, it's important that those who will be affected by the programs, that they need to be consulted in the program design phase. And third, beneficiaries and other relevant constituents should also be included in the design, the implementation, and the interpretation of the evaluation process. Moreover, in the evaluation process, nonprofits need to go beyond examining the intended positive impacts of programs and also be alert to potential presence of unintended impacts. So those are all the 26 items.
What should we take away from this research?
Well, what's interesting and important about our research is that we actually found that a select panel of practitioners, when asked to provide their own list of effectiveness enhancing practices, produced a list of best practices that is very comparable with that based on the research of management scholars. This could either be because the real-life experiences of practitioners lead them to similar conclusions as those reached by the scholars. This is the positive interpretation, but it might also reflect the pervasive influence of management fads as they are absorbed by organizations. To increase the practical value of our comparative exercise, we actually created a self-assessment survey on the basis of the practices that we found a support for in both the research and by these practitioners. This provides managers with a tool to assess the extent to which the identified practices are present in their specific organization. And it also provides suggestions which might lead to the improvement of their effectiveness. But also intermediaries, such as the rating agencies that I was talking about in the beginning, such as Charity Navigator and GuideStar, they can use such a tool to provide better information to donors. And funders can use it in their selection of grantees and capacity building efforts. It is important to say, however, that there are several limitations to measuring the use of best practices to actually make a judgment about organizational effectiveness. First, the measurement of these practices should not be a replacement for the use of other, more traditional forms of evaluations. Secondly, the set of best practices, such as the one that we developed here, like any other management and quality systems, are very vulnerable to a checklist or, let's say, a managed to the measure mentality, where leaders of organizations can become obsessed with fulfilling their requirements. This can result in a disengagement from the overall organizational mission, and then actually having a list like this is not effective anymore. Also, the set of practices discussed here is, of course, not exhaustive, and it's also not stable. As research on nonprofit effectiveness and best practices progresses, the set can be expanded or altered. The progression of the research on the concept and the measurement of nonprofit effectiveness will have to show to what extent the set of practices that we identified in this specific study and the survey that we designed specifically can impact effectiveness, and whether disability varies for various cultural and sector-specific contexts. Further research, we think it would be useful if it could also focus on the potential role of the identified set of practices and the instruments in the processes of organizational change.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for sharing your research with us. The paper, Nonprofit Organizational Effectiveness, Analysis of Best Practices, can be found online at mvs.sagepub.com. Welcome to this nonprofit and voluntary sector quarterly podcast. I'm Danielle Bath, editorial assistant at Sage Publications. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Jeffrey Stinson, professor at Central Washington University, and Dr. Monica Labarge, professor at Queen's University. They recently published a research article in Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly entitled The Role of Mental Budgeting in Philanthropic Decision-Making. Welcome, Jeff and Monica, and thank you for joining me today. To start us off, what is your research question and how did you come to ask it?
We really had three primary research questions in this study. The first was, do donors have charitable mental budgets? If they do have those budgets, do they confine their giving activity just to those budgets, or are they also willing to access other mental accounts to make charitable gifts as well? And if they're accessing other budgets, what are the factors that affect the malleability of those budgets? This really emanates from a research stream that we've been conducting for over a decade now, looking at the various ways that people give. And this specific study came out of some research we were doing on donors to higher education. And in higher education, we divided those donors into donors who were giving gifts to athletic programs and donors who are giving gifts to academic programs. And in an interview study from several years ago, we were talking to groups of those donors and asking them why they gave their gifts to each of those groups. And it was really quite fascinating because if you're familiar with the literature on giving in higher education, often that's a very combative relationship between academic and athletic fundraisers. And they view themselves in competition with one another. And so one of the interview questions we asked was, what is the competition for your gift? And what was really interesting is that folks who were giving gifts to athletic programs told us that the competition, if you will, for those gifts was other discretionary or entertainment expenses. So we had folks telling us, well, we bought football tickets this year and we gave to the athletic program rather than going on a cruise. Or one gentleman was very fond of telling us that it was the boat dealer down the street that was the competition. He didn't buy a boat that year. Instead, he bought football tickets. Yet when we asked that same question to folks who were giving to academic programs, they told us that the competition was things that we would think of more traditionally as altruistic, philanthropic, nonprofit organizations. It was boys and girls clubs. It was the cancer societies, the lung association, these kinds of groups that were the competition for those academic gifts. And it really got us thinking about how donors categorize their giving and how they're actually expensing their gifts against these various accounts when they make their giving decisions.
What is the background or context of your research?
So taking kind of that context, we really started to look at this in light of the mental accounting literature, and it seemed that it was very applicable. And so we went back and looked at that literature that primarily talks about, mental accounting and mental budgeting in the context of normal consumption. And really we wanted to build that in because based on our previous work, we thought there's a strong application for this in the nonprofit context. So we were really marrying what we know about the fundraising literature and our research there with the mental accounting literature to see if that research would hold true in the nonprofit or in the fundraising context. And so, for example, we know that in the normal consumption context, if more mental accounts are made salient, that increases the likelihood of a purchase, it increases the magnitude of that purchase. And so, we hypothesize certainly that doing that in the nonprofit context would lead to higher perceived capacity to give and make it more likely that the donor would actually make a gift. So really it was kind of the marriage of those literatures and studies that served as the foundation for this research.
Could you describe your methodology for us?
As I think Jeff has alluded to, we conducted some qualitative interviews. In this case, we were looking at about 42 people. Now, as we identified over the course of the research, a lot of people will make these fundraising decisions as a couple, as a family. And so in some of those cases, some of those individuals we interviewed them as a husband and wife, for instance. What was interesting was that wasn't true across everybody, that in some cases the wife made the decisions, in some cases the husband made the decisions, in some cases it was both of the partners who made the decision. In terms of the background of the people that we interviewed, they were all existing donors. So we didn't talk to anybody who had never given, for instance. And that was something that, we heard in the review process, and we've heard from other people we talked to them as well, why don't you talk to people who haven't given, because then maybe we can figure out how to get them to start giving. And while, of course, we think that that's really important, that wasn't really the goal of the research here. So what we were looking at was among people who have given at least, fairly regularly, maybe not every year, but at least have given fairly regularly, what affects how much they give and how they allocate those giving resources across different organizations or within an organization. How do they give? Why do they give more or less? So it was really important to us to talk to people who could actually answer those questions. Perhaps talking to people who don't have these charitable mental budgets will be important in the future. But for this project, we were really just looking at people who had experience with giving.
What were your findings?
So we had 3 basic research questions. Our first one was, do donors have charitable mental budgets? And it turns out that yes, they do. Almost everybody we identified we talked to identified that they had some sort of a budget for charitable giving. And interestingly, I think this was one of the most interesting things for me and maybe for Jeff as well, was that it seemed to work out that a lot of people gave about 10% of their income. And we didn't quiz them as to, whether that was gross income or net income or after tax or before tax, but they told us that it worked out to be about 10% of their income. And that was really interesting because that is sort of typically the amount that the church would suggest as sort of a tithe to the church, but ostensibly for charitable purposes. And we had a couple of donors who said that they were religious and that they gave to the church, and it was about 10% of their income. But we also had some other donors who explicitly said that they weren't religious and that they didn't give to the church, but it seemed to work out to be about 10% of their income. We also had some donors who were not Christian, who were Jewish and Muslim, and their percentages varied, but certainly it was, very interesting to us to see that across religions that the giving was a really important part of being a member of the community. So that was our first research question, was, do donors have charitable mental budgets? And as I've already said, the answer to that was yes. Our second question was, is giving confined to charitable budgets, or are there other budgets that are accessed? And again, we found that in a lot of cases, there was more than just the charitable budget that was accessed. We had, for instance, one of my favorite quotes was from this gentleman who described to me how donations to or tickets to galas and buying tables and things like that was a business expense. He was a lawyer. And he said, no, that's a business expense. We sort of rope together enough people to fill the table, and that's not really charitable. That's just business, which is an interesting finding in and of itself. But then literally in the next sentence, he said, there's this gala that I went to recently, and I knew the woman who was being honored. I was friends with her son. And so that was very much a charitable expense. And so it was a bit confusing in some cases to hear the same expense being described as as being allocated to totally different budgets. So we did find that other budgets are accessed, and that's just one example of budgets that we found outside of charitable giving. And then our last question was, what factors affect the malleability of those charitable giving mental budgets? And we found a number of things. Interestingly, the more intrinsic the motives that people had for giving. So for instance, the more they got out of it personally, as opposed to getting some sort of a tax benefit or some sort of a business connection, the more flexible they seemed on the amount that they wanted to give. And in some cases, that was really affected by how much they thought they were going to be able to accomplish by making a gift that was perhaps larger than they had initially intended. So some of our donors spoke to the fact that it was something that was very difficult to fund. So one of our donors spoke to the idea of food insecurity for the poor. And he said, it's not really a very sexy thing to give to, and I know it's really hard to raise money for, and so it's something that I really prioritize supporting. Another couple that we spoke to, they knew that they were going to give to a hospital campaign, but they weren't sure exactly where they were going to give. And they started asking questions about what are some of the things that you have a hard time funding. And one of those things, I think, was language services for recent immigrants. So, they had gone beyond what they were initially planning to give because of what they thought they were going to be able to accomplish through that giving. And we did find that as people were more sophisticated in their relationships with fundraisers and with nonprofit organizations, and the more experience they had and sort of where they were in, if you want to call it the donor life cycle, that they were much more flexible and really driven by sort of a strategic approach to giving, as opposed to just making a gift and letting it sort of be allocated to wherever the fundraiser might like.
What conclusions can we draw from this research?
Oh, based on the findings that Monica explained, I think the big conclusion is that nonprofit organizations should be paying attention to and seeking to understand the mental accounts of their donors. That I think too often we probably focus on just those philanthropic budgets. And certainly I had a gentleman in my office just a couple of days ago telling me that his organization, they were so proud of themselves because they were just going to focus on these philanthropic giving, and that's great. But what we find in this research is that probably limits the organization in the amount of money that they can generate. Because while donors do have these mental budgets for philanthropy, they're also willing to expense and make gifts out of other budgets. So if we can make some of those other budgets salient to them, it may be that we're able to increase their capacity to give and ultimately get more gifts and larger gifts from those folks by understanding the fact that they maintain these accounts and they manage these accounts, and that a nonprofit organization can take advantage of understanding that flexibility and that malleability to increase their giving. So to me, that's the real big conclusion here, the real big takeaway. People do have philanthropic mental accounts. That's good news because it means that folks are willing to make these gifts. But perhaps even the more exciting news is that they don't limit their giving just to those charitable accounts, and that does give us the opportunity as fundraisers to tap into those accounts and perhaps generate additional funding.
What is the future or next step for your research?
Well, fortunately, given the amount of data that we have, I think I'm mentioning that we had 42 individuals who we interviewed. We still do have quite a bit of data that we didn't talk about in this article. One of the things that we're really interested in delving a little bit more into is, now that we know that some of these budgets are malleable, and we have some idea of what some of the factors are, we really want to get a little bit more into what actually drives that malleability. So what are some of the factors beyond what we identified here? And, to what extent is our budgets malleable? Are they, can we double them or triple them, or is there a restriction on that? And then what are some of the ways that we can maybe position expenses as being attached or similar to that budget, but that maybe we can go outside of that. And I think the other interesting thing we'd like to look into is, as I mentioned, that idea of sort of a donor life cycle, that how do changes within donors themselves as they become more involved with an organization, either maybe as volunteers or as board members, how does that change the way that they approach their giving? Because we did see a lot of evidence of that and didn't necessarily directly connect to our research question, but that's some of the data that we think we have and that we would like to pursue a little bit more as we move forward.
Thank you, Jeff and Monica, and thank you for sharing your research with us. The role of mental budgeting in philanthropic decision-making can be found online at nvs.sagepub.com. Welcome to this nonprofit and voluntary sector quarterly podcast. I'm Danielle Bath, editorial assistant at Sage Publications. Today I'm speaking with Mark Hager, associate professor of philanthropic studies at Arizona State University's School of Community Resources and Development. He recently published a research paper in Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly entitled Engagement Motivations in Professional Associations. The article won the American Society of Association Executives Outstanding Academic Publication on Membership Organizations Award. Congratulations, Mark, and thank you for joining us today.
Great. Thank you, Danielle.
So your article is about professional associations. Is association just another name for a nonprofit?
Well, nonprofit is a wide and messy space. It includes many different flavors and varieties of organizations, including organizations that provide services, those that promote causes, those that help us celebrate our culture. It's a really wide assortment, kind of a catch-all category. Associations are a particular type of nonprofit organization. Associations have and represent their members. Examples include unions, the National Football League, the American Medical Association. And so in the case of associations, you've got a nonprofit that's usually just a front office that serves those members and tries to keep them happy. So in my work, I was interested in a particular kind of member association called the professional association, where members all work in the same field, and the association provides them avenues for professional development and networking and represent the field to a broader audience. The American Medical Association would be an example of a professional association.
What specific aspects of professional associations were you interested in studying?
I'm interested in what motivates members to engage with their associations. Many people might, at minimum, be a member of their association, but they don't do any more than just pay dues and list their affiliation on their resume and don't do anything more than that. Others really engage in and really do the work of the collective and are much more engaged than just people that are simply pay dues and are members. One way they do this is they spend time working on conference activities or presenting content at association meetings. Another indication of engagement is a decision to contribute money to the association above and beyond membership dues. And another is a willingness to speak positively about the association to colleagues who might want to become members.
What different incentives do people have to engage their associations? Or more specifically, what did you mean by public versus private incentives?
Well, I try to tap into a long debate about why people might choose to join and actively work in their associations. The debate is between these private motivations and public motivations. Private motivations are the what's in it for me. Is this going to help me advance my career? Is this going to give me programming that will help in my personal development? Private incentives can be very powerful motivators, and some people say that they're really all that matter. Public incentives, on the other hand, are the what does this association do to advance all of us? Like, does my association help raise understanding of issues relevant to my field? And does it lobby on behalf of issues that are of public concern? Those kinds of things. So my main question is what kinds of incentives, public, private, a mixture of these things, might help us understand member engagement with people's professional associations?
What data did you draw on for your study?
I used data that had already been collected by others. It was collected by the American Society of Association Executives, which is itself a professional association, and they collected data from 5 of their member associations, so individuals within those 5 member associations. 3 of these were in the engineering field, one being the American Society of Civil Engineers, and 2 were in the healthcare field, one of those being the American College of Healthcare Executives.
What did you find out from this research?
Well, the results weren't totally straightforward, so I invite people to go take a close look at the paper if they're really interested in the details. But generally, I looked separately at the engineering associations and at the healthcare associations to see the relationships between these motivations and these different types of engagement. And for the engineering associations, the public incentives were more important than private incentives in getting members to donate money beyond their membership fees. Neither public nor private incentives helped us understand whether engineering association members were engaged in the activities of the association or not. However, the data suggests the members who value the career opportunities that their association brings were much less likely to volunteer their time to the association's happening. So that was sort of a surprising finding. That said, both public and private incentives are related to feelings of commitment to these engineering associations that I studied. In the healthcare associations, it was the private incentives that motivate the charitable contributions and not the public ones. So a real difference there between the healthcare and the engineering associations. Volunteerism is not generally explained by either the public or the private incentives there, although volunteers do seem to value the leadership experience that the association brings to them and are put off by information about field developments. Unlike the engineering associations, commitment to the association is not explained by these kinds of private incentives. So one of the main takeaways emphasizes these differences between professional associations and just these 2 fields that I studied. I really caution about making sweeping generalizations across professional associations generally.
To close, what different audiences would be interested in reading your article?
Well, organizational and nonprofit scholars, certainly, but I'm also speaking to people who run associations, people who are trying to maximize their services and their members' commitment to those associations. If we can understand better what makes our members and our associations tick, then we can do a better job of keeping people engaged in them.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for sharing your research with us. The paper, Engagement Motivations in Professional Associations, is published in the April 2014 issue of Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly and can be found online at nvs.sagepub.com.